The Invisible Library by Genevieve Cogman is a multiple reality fantasy novel about a search for the perfect book. It is, I suppose, a little bit like C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew, only the woods between the worlds is actually a library, and the worlds you can reach are all Earth, but with very minor differences in technology and magic. Our main character, Irene, is a librarian sent on a mission to procure a very specific book, a particular first edition copy of Grimm's fairy tales published in 1812. Why? She doesn't have clearance to know, she just has to do. But saddled with Kai, a trainee librarian on his first field mission, and a chaos-infused alternate world, this isn't the simple grab and go she was hoping for. So yeah, it's like the multiverse of madness, but in between the worlds is a huge-ass library, and the main character is literally obsessed with reading and grammar. What's not to like? So I went into this book thinking I would probably enjoy it. I like libraries, I like alternate dimensions. The first scene throws you straight into the action with Irene stealing a book from a snooty boys' boarding school in a magical dimension, which was great. And then almost immediately she is sent on her first mission to a steampunk Victorian set alternate with mythological creatures like vampires and fairies, where the infusion of chaos is at a level where logic is beginning to turn into fairy tale logic. To steal a copy of Grimm's fairy tales. You do not understand how much I loved everything. The premise was excellent, the setting was perfect, the world building nearly magnificent. Look, it's not bad, but it did sort of start to fall apart about halfway through, and I guess maybe my expectations were a bit high in my excitement, but I'll get onto that later. And I do honestly still believe that this book has tons of good stuff in it. I honestly absolutely adore the way this was set up. It had the exciting opening, the library setting, the world building was still good, what they did of it. I love that the library is so huge, it's easy just to send emails using old Windows desktops to people than it is to just go and find them. I love that the librarians have a sort of magic in the language, which is like the true language, I guess, and they can use it to control the universe, I guess a little bit like Aragon or the Earthsea Quartet. And as such, the magic system worked well because you could clearly understand what could and couldn't be done, as the universe still had its rules. You cannot make something do something that it could not naturally do. I also enjoyed the use of fairy tale and fairies in general in this. There are references throughout as the other librarians, or all the librarians, are able to sort of pick their own librarian name, and a lot of them do come from folklore and fairy tale. Not all, as I'm pretty sure Irene takes her name from Sherlock Holmes, as in Irene Adler, as she loves detective fiction. But many of the others do, which is nice, and I also liked the way the fairies interact with the steampunk alternate when they reach it. I just needed a bit more of that, but I'll get onto it later. The writing is also good, with some lovely turns of phrase, which is a relief because of how much this book stresses the importance of like grammar. Otherwise it would have been really quite awkward. I also enjoyed Liechtenstein as being the world's superpower. It just doesn't turn up in many English written novels, so it was nice to see it. Good on you, Liechtenstein. But sadly, not all is perfect. Some of the characters were a little lackluster. Irene I thought was excellent. Kai is maybe a little muddled, but I think that was sort of the point of him. I understood why characters from the alternate were perhaps a bit on the stereotypical side, as that world was dissolving into fairy tale logic. It makes sense for people to become sort of caricatures in a way. But I found Bradamant a little boring. So Bradamant is the rival librarian who's super attractive and proficient and amazing, but also cruel and selfish and cold and sort of bitchy. And she and Irene have history together, and I just didn't care for her. I will concede the book didn't play into all the stereotypes. She wasn't a romantic rival or anything like that, and it clearly tried to deconstruct and play around with the trope, but it was a little too late for me. I guess the twists could have been a bit more interesting as well. There's quite a big one at the end, which honestly I'd worked out before the characters did, like almost immediately. I knew what was up. And that wouldn't usually bother me, but it felt a little bit too obvious for the characters to not see it coming, so that was a bit frustrating. And it was also a little bit confusing at times, which I mean, fair enough. When the multiple universe theory is 100% confirmed by the library and its librarians, theoretical progressions are of course going to be mind-boggling. And there were perhaps a few too many asides and conversations about the theories of an already theoretical world, which I didn't understand and therefore couldn't fully enjoy. So maybe a little less of that really complicated stuff, which wasn't really that important. As I mentioned earlier, my expectations were so high that I turned this into a self-fulfilling prophecy of disappointment. I suppose with all the mentions of fairy tales and fairy tale logic throughout, I was expecting that to play into the plot and world a little bit more, but it actually leaned more into the steampunk side of things, with the technology and the political activism and the terrorist groups, which I suppose just isn't as interesting to me. I like the aesthetic of steampunk, but it was the fairy tale mentions that really spoke to me, and they weren't as fully realised as I was expecting and hoping. So don't sell me a world based on fairy tale logic and then give me one fairy and no accompanying logic apart from that. In the fairy's mind, everything is like a fairy tale. Everything's a story, which was hilarious, don't get me wrong. I thought that was actually quite a good way of having the fairies. They see everything as a story, but it wasn't enough. And even the elements of folklore that they did have, the werewolves and the vampires and all that, they didn't really feature very much, sadly. And honestly, the biggest thing that irked me was the romance, kind of, if you can call it that. It was all sort of smushed into one scene, really, which I'll explain now. There is a scene about a third of the way through the book where Irene and Kai have entered the alternates, they've done some snooping, and they've met back at their hotel to ponder and rest, and yes, this is exactly where that's going. I was expecting there to be some like mild flirting, a bit of sexual tension, that sort of thing. After all, when Irene first meets Kai, she waxed fairly lyrical about how beautiful he is, but instead Kai basically asks her if they're going to get it on, which is kind of weird. And then Irene is like, no, I'm working, just go to sleep. He doesn't drop it immediately, which is creepy. And then they have an argument about how they are totally amazing in bed and the other is missing out, which was a little bit weird and sort of reminded me of that scene from Indiana Jones, which I don't like that scene anyway. Irene then tells Kai that he isn't her type despite her clearly fancying him earlier, and then that's it. He goes to sleep. She gets all thirsty over him later on when they go to a ball and half regrets saying no, and then that's it for the entire book. My issues are, one, it kind of came out of nowhere. She thought he was pretty, he was an attractive male in a female protagonist-led book. There was no build-up. Two, it went nowhere. You could take that scene out and literally nothing would change, which is true for most sexy scenes in most books. But this wasn't even a sexy scene, it was the antithesis of a sexy scene. So what was the point? And three, this is a little bit more subjective, I just sort of found it distasteful. Like, they just met that day, and he just kind of assumes they'd be having relations. And I'm not huge on hookup culture, so for me it was just kind of weird. But from a writing perspective, it was just this random scene that had no point and that came out of nowhere and then returned to nowhere. Why? I don't know. I don't know what the point of it was. Maybe, I think there actually are sequels to this, so maybe it was laying foundations for a later romance, but in just this book, it was completely pointless. All in all, a book with a great setup, but lacking in execution. But despite that, I did honestly enjoy it. I mean, where else are you going to read about a dude fighting cyborg alligators with a tea tray whilst dressed up in fancy ball clothes? I've not found one yet. So that's all I have to say. The book I'm currently reading is terrible, so look forward to me probably getting very, very frustrated. Let me know what you thought below, and goodbye, my friends. Ciao.